Good morning, everybody. My name is Jason Jay. I'm a lecturer here at the MIT Sloan School of Management and the director of the Sustainability Initiative here, which has been one of the sponsors for the conference. The panel that we're going to do right now focuses on the role of business in this whole conversation about collective intelligence, crowds, and solving climate change and other important social challenges. The way we're going to do this is we have three fantastic panelists. Peter Evans comes from a background at GE, which he'll share. He was the head of strategy and analytics for a key part of the business there, worked on fuel and energy and water analytics, and also led one of the biggest imagination jams and kind of internal crowdsourcing and collective intelligence events at GE. And we're going to have him get us started by talking about the role that crowds can play in enhancing the way businesses do innovation, the way businesses solve problems, and a little bit about the applications of that in the clean energy and climate and sustainability domains. Then we're going to get a chance to hear from Nancy Pfund, who is a venture capitalist who has funded with DBL Investors a number of companies that you've heard of, from Tesla to SolarCity to BrightSource in the clean tech space. And she's going to be talking about the business opportunities in climate change and how they've seen crowdfunding, crowd-based innovation, crowd-based mobilization be really important processes and methods in those kinds of businesses. And then we'll hear from Otto Scharmer, who's a colleague of mine at the Sloan School and director of the Presencing Institute, who I think will help us broaden the conversation here from crowds to collective intelligence, and how to think about collective intelligence more broadly with crowds as one piece of that puzzle. And I think that will enrich and deepen the conversation here about what it takes to bring new approaches to solving problems to the business world and to this intersection between business and climate. So I'm going to, rather than do this as sort of a stand-up presentation, what we want to do is do this more in a conversational format and invite each of them to share a few thoughts, and then we'll kind of be in dialogue and then leave time for plenty of questions, audience questions, and interaction in the second half. So Peter, I'd just like you to share a little bit about your background and experience and frame up this whole domain of how to use crowds in business.
Sure, happy to do so. It's great to be here. Really appreciate the opportunity. I've just left GE to join a new organization called the Center for Global Enterprise. It was founded by Sam Palmisano, the former CEO and chairman of IBM. And it's an organization designed to really understand the firm in an era of globalization and rapid technology change. And so bringing in some of these concepts is a critical mission of the center. When I was at MIT, I went to MIT too, but when I was at GE, GE is a big organization, always trying to push for new ideas and innovation. And I was casting about for a new idea, and I called and had a conversation with Rob Laubacher, who was here, and Lou Carranza, and they were thinking about this idea of crowdsourcing. And I said, well, why don't I imply that at GE? And so it takes a bit of work to launch one of these things in a big organization, but I thought the opportunity total of about 40,000 engineers offer a rich source of intelligence. So we've been talking this morning about external ideas and where you can harness communities outside the organization, but big companies have their own communities inside them, and tapping them. And they have their own procedures and mechanisms and rhythms. And the question is how do you shake them up? And are there low-hanging fruit that you can tap? And what I found is that it's useful to think, or basically go beyond thinking of firms as just clusters of capital and labor, and think of them as networks. And how do you tap into those networks? And if you can use crowdsourcing to actually enhance those networks. So this is a picture that I use internally to kind of sell this idea of an imagination jam within the company, which is to talk about the linkages within the organization. You have silos, and the question is how do you break down those and tap into the wealth of knowledge within the organization, and basically build richer networks and really tap into those so that you can communicate across the organization in new ways, facilitate collaboration, and share ideas with people in the organization that wouldn't be normally talking to each other. And so this is the result. We launched it, this was in 2011, and it ran for a month. And the thing that was I think unique about it is that we harnessed the commercial team to go out to our customers and ask them what were their real big challenges that they were facing, and then bring those inside the organization and present them to the engineers. And so it was a way to more closely link the guys that are out in the field talking to the customers on a day-to-day basis with the engineers that often get, they get procurement and line questions about how to design new things, but they're often disconnected somewhat from the customers as you go through that process. So what we did is we opened this up. About 5,000 people participated in the jam, and you can see what we did was we mapped where the ideas came from. And one of the challenges in doing crowdsourcing is how do you review the ideas? Because you get some good ideas and some bad ideas. And so the way that we structured this is that we had the community itself do the peer review, which let a lot of onus off of us because we're not experts in these technologies. And so if you can facilitate peer review in it, you can quickly eliminate the bad ideas, and then the good ideas surface to the top. What this map shows, I think, is the range of different parts of the organization that contributed. And so you had parts of GE Water contributing, you had GE Central Engineering contributing, you had the oil and gas business, and then you had others like the Global Research Institute participating as well. And so I think it really demonstrated the value of actually tapping into the broader organization to harness ideas more broadly. So I think this strategy does have a lot of potential in large organizations to tap communities that are there but aren't necessarily being fully harnessed. The point I guess I want to move to is a broader point, and that is tapping into this from an individual organization is one thing, but you need to scale it to affect the broader numbers of companies. There's a lot of companies out there. They're critical for delivering the goods and services that we rely on and drive the global economy. This is just the top 500 firms. How many of these are actually using these techniques? And I would posit that it's actually very small. It is very much on an experimental basis right now. Right now in the United States, there are about 194 companies that are in the Global 500. In Europe, another 126, and then you go through the rest of the world. So there's a lot of companies that can still continue to harness these types of techniques to drive, I guess, faster innovation and hopefully drive greater productivity. And I want to just conclude on this slide, which is a picture of the thermal fleet of power plants around the world. This would include natural gas, coal, and oil. And so it's not necessarily all about inventing the next generation of technology. It's actually driving efficiency and improvements in the existing fleet of power production. There are over 560,000 power plants in the world. And so tapping into some of these crowdsourcing activities to drive greater efficiency and improve the environmental performance of these, I think, is a key goal that should be embraced.
Yep. And it's interesting. So what you just said sort of builds on something that we heard from Karim Lakhani in the last panel, which is that we need to move from sort of crowdsourcing of ideas as a pilot project, something that's tried in a one-off way, to something that's really integrated into organizational practice in a more serious way. And so you described a little bit about the example from GE, but also kind of how big the potential is, right? How many more organizations could be taking advantage of these techniques to harness the intelligence inside their organizations? The other thing that I wanted to just pick up on, and something that you said, is that, and that I think the rest of our panel will be elaborating on, is that you talk about the network, right? And the network isn't just about individuals with ideas, but it's about the connections between them, right? So when we saw, Karim's video of the college senior with the diabetes ideas, that's kind of an individual intelligence that's being pulled in by the crowd by a crowdsourcing system, what you're talking about is actually connections between people and maybe a slightly more complex idea of what collective intelligence is. And, we'll when we get to Otto, we'll talk more about what that looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I think this notion of standing on the shoulders of giants is critical. You don't want to rehash things that have already been done. And if you do these crowdsourcing activities the right way, you quickly eliminate and help educate people to that, hey, that idea has been tried before. And so then you're building rather than just reduplicating things that have already taken place.
Yep, and that's sort of a design criteria for effectively using these kinds of tools. Great. So Nancy, I'd like you to talk a little bit about your background and experience in the business and climate domain, and then a little bit about where you've seen crowd-based approaches be of use in that context.
Great. Well, it's wonderful to be here. Thanks to Tom Malone and the MIT crew for inviting me and for designing this conference. It's so timely with the Twitter IPO tomorrow and just the kinds of developments that we've seen over the past few years. The crowd is really becoming just another tool in the venture capital investment toolkit. So DBL is a double bottom line venture capital firm. We invest for both top tier financial return, but also social return. And we believe that the two goals enhance each other. And we've had some great proof points of that. And I would say that we intersect with the crowd in many ways. A lot of times clean tech investing is intersecting with cause movements, with people want solar because they want to do something about climate change. And the crowd is a very potent element in those kinds of intersections, bringing together people from disparate backgrounds that actually join together and want to start a company or buy a product because of those two angles. And so it's a wonderful way to create more diversity in your network around a company, both on the customer side and the supplier and investor side. And so certainly the venture capital world, irrespective of clean tech, has been changed by crowdfunding. I mean, I just looked at a deal yesterday, talked to a guy where the first round was $9 million of crowdfunding. I mean, one of the co-founders was Reid Hoffman, so I mean, that's one of the reasons why it was so much. But that never happened before. I mean, angel investors is a variant on that, but crowdfunding is much more viral and rapid. So and that just changes our business a little bit, mostly for the better, because you can look at companies that have been vetted already because they've gotten some funding in advance. I would also say that back to this link between cause and crowd and clean tech, that the whole development around crowdfunding renewable energy projects, be they a rooftop solar or a solar farm, is incredibly potent. I mean, I think most people have heard of Mosaic, which is one of the new entrants in that field, where they basically crowdsource funding for solar projects, and I think they've done a little over 5 million, and they're raising capital, expanding, bringing some veterans from the industry into that team, and that is being watched by everyone in the clean tech field. And Mosaic has a great brand, has a great start, but I think it will proliferate. Because as most people who follow clean tech know, a lot of funding of clean tech is dependent on the investment tax credit and tax equity funds, which are really difficult to structure. They're expensive. You need tons of lawyers and accountants. And that's why the big banks and Google and big companies do that. But it leaves a big hole, and it's not enough. I mean, the growth of renewable energy demands a better funding supply, and people that want to get, say, a 4 or 5% return by just putting money into these little projects, that's very, very attractive to a lot of people, and you can aggregate that and all of a sudden move the needle. So we're very bullish on the role of crowdfunding to democratize access to renewable and energy efficiency funding and create a whole nother financial product for people, that don't have the means to be in a venture capital fund or don't have an extensive stock portfolio so they can play clean tech that way. A lot of people just don't have that disposable income to invest, and yet they could put a little bit here and there in projects that appeal to them. So, and I know that even the big players in this industry, the SunEdisons, the Solar Cities, are looking at the crowd as kind of one of the next chapters. So I think that's extremely important. And then just in terms of introductory remarks, the role of the crowd in accelerating the development of products in clean tech companies is critical and allows you to get feedback so much faster than the old days, and again, from a more diverse set of folks. And so I think that is something that we see. You use Facebook, you use social media to test. We have one company that makes a compostable paper bottle to replace plastic jugs for laundry soap or milk, or we have a canister for protein powder, wine. So a huge improvement in the carbon footprint of packaging, and packaging has been asleep for a long time in terms of its sustainability. But we use Facebook. This company just really wants to hear and incorporate the views of the crowd in terms of the design. Is it enough to have the outside be compostable and the inside plastic pouch be recyclable, or do people want the whole thing to be compostable? And so it's a very important tool in your product development now. And then I would also say, just you mentioned Tesla. I mean, I think we have one of the best examples of the role of the crowd in clean tech, and fighting that fight, defending. Clean tech is always under attack. All those 56,000 power plants, those are the target for clean tech. We want to put them out of business someday. But I think what you saw with Tesla. I think what you saw with Tesla in the New York Times. When was that? With the New York Times writer that totally botched his trip from Washington to Boston and wrote about it, and just did a terrible job in terms of honoring the product, respecting what you need to do with an electric car, and just really making it a pretty damaging article. Well, the crowd, the Tesla owners, some of whom never met one another, they just said enough is enough, and they mobilized, and then they drove from Maryland to Boston, and didn't didn't run out of charge, did it very easily, and they tweeted every time they could. So and in the end, the New York Times public advocate, or a woman that kind of studies these situations, she wrote and said, you know what, the reporter wasn't 100% wrong, but he did some things wrong. And so that was, we all declared victory. And the crowd really is necessary in clean tech, because you're taking on very entrenched odds, be they the 56,000 power plants or the venerable New York Times. Everyone is always, there's always someone out there that's trying to defend the status quo. And so crowds are extremely helpful to clean tech companies in articulating and magnifying the role of customer preferences, and turning that into a vehicle, a weapon really, to fight against the incumbents.
Yes, yes. So one of the things that I was hearing what you were saying was kind of an echo of this idea that crowds lower the barriers to entry. Right? Crowds lower the barrier. Crowd-based approaches lower the barriers to access and entry. In the crowdfunding case, it's for dollars, right? Getting access to be able to invest in projects that otherwise you need lawyers for. In the lowering the barrier to being able to provide feedback on products in their early stages of development, and being able to have voice in terms of mobilization for the advocacy for a new technology platform and a new business model. So those are some sort of, we're now hearing like a few different kind of archetypes or ways that this can show up in the business world that's important. Otto, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the work you've been doing with the Presencing Institute and how you see crowds fitting into a broader conversation about collective intelligence that might help kind of deepen and enrich this whole conversation.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I would like to maybe start with an observation, kind of having been part of the audience kind of in the first part of the morning. There's two observations. One is we had a number of really great examples of how to use the power of crowds in a number of occasions, mostly related to knowledge creation, really. And then we had the keynote this morning from Fred, where he said, actually, we know about everything we need to know. And that the problem is the knowing-doing gap. And how can we address that? And what is the link, really, to collective intelligence there, and to how we use and how we leverage the power of crowds? So I would like to share just a few observation experiences around that. And I guess the main proposition, or the main, the main kind of proposition or distinction that maybe I want to introduce into the conversation is a distinction between using the power of crowds horizontally, right, in terms of leveraging horizontal collective intelligence versus the vertical use. And horizontally, what I mean with horizontally is basically mean kind of, building knowledge and kind of using the power of crowds for knowledge creation. And what I mean with the vertical dimension of using collective intelligence is addressing the knowing-doing gap by transforming consciousness from a state of awareness that you can, for example, refer to as ecosystem awareness, kind of where my main focus is really to, create kind of to further my own well-being, to ecosystem awareness that could be kind of loosely defined as focusing both on my own well-being, but also the well-being of the whole and the well-being of all other stakeholders in the system. And so my professional field or expertise or background really is about leadership and kind of collective leadership. And I personally, when you define leadership as the capacity of a system to sense and shape the future, then I believe that the most important leadership challenge of our time has to do with addressing this knowing-doing gap, or has to do with helping complex stakeholder systems that operate mainly on an ecosystem awareness, which is a relatively narrow perspective, to one that is based on ecosystem awareness, kind of where basically there is a shared awareness of the situation, which then informs individual and collective action. So I think that's kind of the big challenge out there. And I would like to share 3 quick stories that indicate some of that, and that might be useful for our conversation later on. The first story is, when I launched, and that must have been in the late 1990s, into this whole area of inquiry, I did an interview project with 150 thought leaders and practitioners around profound innovation and change. And one of them, the late CEO of Hanover Insurance, Bill O'Brien, he summarized his key learning experience as a CEO of leading transformative change with the following sentence. He said, "The success of an intervention depends on the interior condition of the intervener." So let me translate. The success of what I do as a change maker depends on the inner state, the inner place from that I'm operating. And when I heard that, really it was for me, like a light bulb went on. So because I realized we in the leadership and research community, we know everything about what leaders do. We know everything about how successful a leader is, kind of the process dimension, processes we apply. But what do we know about the source dimension, about the inner place from that we operate? And the quality of awareness, of attention, of consciousness that we bring into a situation. So what a so that's kind of the first story. So that was, for me, a moment of waking up. And what I then, in my remaining research, started to explore, and experimentation started to explore is, what does that mean on the collective dimension? Okay, so that was kind of, he spoke on his own, based on his own experience. But on a collective level, what does that mean? So how can we create conditions that allow this collective awareness and consciousness to shift from ego to eco? And so 2 examples on that. One is so that must have been around 2005, 2006. Together with some colleagues at the Sloan School, I went around and asked big global companies and governmental and international institutions and NGOs whether they would be interested in building a platform that's exploring that question in a practical way, bringing in high potential leaders, and basically bringing them on a journey where they would do practical experimentations around that. And the core assumptions in doing that is, what does it take to move on a collective level from ego to eco? It takes a journey. And so the question is, what are the key elements or the enabling conditions for that journey? And so that took around 12 months. It resulted into everyone stood in their job, but then engaged in these shared activities. The result was personal transformation high, relational transformation high. The prototype, the practical hands-on results, mixed. In the end, 5 years on, I realized that these prototypes had a very profound impact. So what was mixed in the beginning, medium, longer term, turned out to be very significant, resulting in new companies, in new ways of, on a government level, creating policies, in building on a variety of areas, new platforms of collaboration, including in Indonesia and now also in China. And I want to, so what have been the key enabling conditions or learnings there? I just want to give the headlines, and maybe later on we can explore them in the discussion. The first one is container and convening the key players who need each other in order to change the system. So it's a more intentional use of the crowd, you could say. It's basically bringing together institutions and key players that need each other in order to change the system. And to create container means a safe place where they can move into more co-creative ways of working together. Number 2, co-sensing. So the first one is like co-initiating. Co-sensing, so the one thing that we found is really changing the mindset. The most easy way is to go to the places of most potential. So to go to the place of most potential where you, through learning journeys, through seeing the system from the edges, particularly from the most marginalized groups, really tap not only into an open mind, but also an open heart, tap the power of empathy. 3, the use of mindfulness techniques, really creating quality environments for deep reflection, inquiring into the questions, who is myself? What is my work? What really is the larger journey that we are here for, individually, but also collectively. And 4, prototyping, creating cross-institutional platforms where emerging and younger leaders can create prototypes and that explore the future by doing that you could not get away with in your own organizations. So where you explore the new collaborative space that's out there. And as the result of these and other activities, let me close with a last little story from earlier this term. So this platform of cross-sector collaboration that now has been, is also being built in China with the Chinese government. We did one program there, an initiative around collaborative innovation in one of the key provinces in Zhejiang. And now they ask us, our partners in the Chinese government ask us to work with the one of the big state-owned enterprises. In fact, which is the biggest bank in the world and the biggest company in the world, according to the Fortune 2000, that's for the first time topped by a Chinese company, which is ICBC. So they sent some of their senior executives, the high potential leaders, into this type of cross-sector collaboration platform and program. When they came here on campus for 2 weeks, one of the activities we do with them is, I saw Professor John Sterman earlier. I think you will meet him tomorrow afternoon when he will be here on a panel. So he is running the climate change simulation game, which is online available, climateinteractive.org. And the way it works is kind of people get a briefing, they split up in teams, and when they enter the room, it's like 4 delegation tables for the United States, EU, other developed countries, and then China, India, and other developing countries. And they, then the facilitator is the Secretary General and gives like an overview of a briefing about the current crisis, and then is asking people to make decisions on when the emission growth will stop, when it will start to decrease, and at what rate. And then that's being inputted into the simulation model, which is based on peer-reviewed science. And then they are confronted with the results, and then it's the second round and sometimes the third round. So having seen that for several times, it usually ends in a catastrophe. It's like kind of just a microcosm of our real situation. And then you have the sea level rise and all these other things. Now, what happened this time, and then kind of seeing the groups then dealing with denial, with depression, kind of as the magnitude of the challenge, realizing the magnitude of the challenge, or with cynicism. And so this time, something different happened. So that people, the group actually kind of being split up into these groups, rose to the occasion. They almost had a breakthrough. And the type of kind of energy was quite different. And coming away from that, I really thought, well, what were the conditions that allowed this group to really rise to the occasion and to come up with a more collaborative, more co-creative way of addressing that situation? And the enabling condition, I think, have some really key lessons for the vertical dimension of using collective intelligence. One, you need to bring together all key players into the same room. Kind of the facilitator literally locked people in and said, you're not getting out of here kind of without making a decision. So it's kind of the container. 2, science and data. It's kind of that you really see the long-term impact of your own situation. 3, it's visualizing that, kind of translating that into essential experience. It's the aesthetic dimension. So seeing what's the impact of 2-3 meters sea level rise for our own home city and so on. 4, creating a condition for the system to see itself. That's the turning point. That's kind of where the collective awareness begins to shift. So creating conditions for the system to see itself, only then the pattern begins to shift from the individually driven to collectively driven. And last one, the facilitator, who basically is holding the space for these 4 things and is allowing reality to sink in. Reality already operates on an ecosystem level. It's just our awareness kind of structured on a smaller or more narrow kind of ecosystem definition. So seeing, kind of holding the space for this data, for this collective reality to sink in, you could almost watch how that changed the structure of awareness and then changed the structure how the group was collaborating and co-creating with each other. I think that has a lot of lessons for the real-world challenge that we face.
Yep. I think there's a couple of things in what you just said. One is this verticality dimension, right? And that we could crowdsource ideas or money or mobilization, but if people are coming to that conversation from their existing set of motivations and incentives and so on, we may not get as far as we need to get. relative to if we had some way of transforming people's consciousness, awareness, and so on. And in particular, this idea of people getting a view of the larger system, of how their effort fits into the larger whole, and having a sense of that whole, not just a sense of them as an atomistic participant in a contest, right? The other thing, though, that I heard in your description about the ideas program is that there's an important time dimension, right? The prototypes that they came out with in that first round, okay, mixed. But if you look at them 5 years out, some of them have evolved into solutions and new businesses and things that may have some really compelling power. And I think that's a really important challenge to this whole idea of crowdsourcing, is that I think the assumption is, okay, well, we know crowdsourcing works if there's an idea that you can run it through a compiler, immediately know what the answer is, and rate, produce the graph that shows what the high quality innovations are here, and we can go with those. But anything that requires a longer time horizon or time delay may be more challenging to work with in terms of these collective intelligence approaches, and may require a more sustained engagement with a community of people rather than sort of these one-off contests. I wanted to see whether the two of you guys had reactions either to each other's or to Otto's thoughts before we open it up for the audience questions.
Well, I think it's kind of getting a handle on the range of ways you can apply these techniques. There's clearly ways you can do it externally, but there's also ways you can do it internally in your organization. And then fundamentally, what kinds of questions are you asking? But we have to step back and recognize that companies are incentivized in certain ways. And you can do lots of innovation, but if there isn't market pull for that innovation, it's not going to have an impact. So there's a question around crowdsourcing of you can drive a certain level of innovation, but if there isn't that necessary demand pull, it's not going to move into the marketplace. And maybe you can raise consciousness around it, but I'm a little skeptical that if there isn't that bottom line dollar and the ability to sell to customers, you're not going to change the needle that you're seeking to do.
And that might require some policy changes that change the incentives that are bearing on companies.
Exactly.
And this afternoon, we'll have a panel that kind of gets at how can we use the crowd to mobilize people for those sorts of policy changes. But that's an important piece of that's an important ingredient, because otherwise companies are going to use crowdsourcing to start to, make the next widget within the current system, not necessarily go beyond.
Right, there's the tool, but you could use it to optimize the performance of a coal-fired power plant just as much as driving innovations around electric vehicles.
Well, I would say that clean tech is lucky in the sense that it can use the crowd in the mobilization way more readily than other facets of innovative industries. I mean, like, we were investors in Pandora, and everyone loves Pandora, but it's, and people mobilize their favorite artists and their favorite songs and things like that, but people didn't really mobilize, some did, but the whole Digital Music Copyright Act that is necessary to allow digital music to thrive, that wasn't a grassroots movement. I mean, there were certainly some Pandora customers that mobilized, but not a lot. Whereas in clean tech, when it gets back to, you're not just buying panels or leasing panels on your roof, you're making, or putting an EV in your garage, you are making a statement about what you want your world to look like for yourself and for your children and grandchildren. And so that is an immensely powerful mobilization tool. And you're seeing, especially because most clean tech policies are made at state or regional levels, because of the kind of paralysis in Washington, you see like net metering. I mean, the whole battle that's going on between incumbent utilities and the new entrants, the renewable entrants, and the role of the public utility commissions in each state in educating that, you're beginning to see the fact that people that are customers of solar companies now helping to fight those battles. And that's immensely powerful, because it's a very entrenched decision-making regulatory regime. It has, for 100 years, we got our electricity in the same way. And so those utilities have a way of working with the regulators, which is
very set and very efficient. So there needs to be something to come kind of break that up a little bit, and it's not going to come from within, and it's going to come from the crowd.
Yes.
And so this dual role of a customer and an advocate,
Yes.
clean tech is so lucky to be able to mine that.
Yes, yes. Great.
Well, I fully agree with that. And so the example I gave really just is touching into the collective leadership bit of it, kind of the shifting the awareness around that. And it's absolutely true, kind of, that is one leverage point. It's not the only one. It needs to be complemented really with a whole new set of institutional innovations that also, to your point, Nancy, really is basically turning, it's like what we are talking about is an inversion process of institutional power, kind of turning inside out, and also taking something outside in, and basically moving into fields of collaboration where what used to be handled kind of inside organizations is done much more direct, much more distributed, much more democratic, and also much more dialogic. And the dialogic one is kind of the the vertical dimension of this collective intelligence. But it's the same development in just about all the key areas of societal innovation today.
So let's take some comments and questions from the audience. We've got 2 microphones here, and you can come and line up, and I'll alternate between the 2 lines as we pull in questions.
Hello again. I am a retired engineer, and fortunately, I got a few patents a few years ago. The patent system has changed, and it's very bad for an independent inventor because you have to very quickly get the patent. You can't take a few years with your provisionals. So I'm encouraging, let's say, General Electric to think about the fact that not everybody, as somebody pointed out earlier, wants to sort of give away freely some basic, ideas. You might have I forget what the words are, open source. Yeah, open source is good, software and things like that. But if you have a really great invention and you've been working a few years on it, you don't necessarily want to just put it out there for free because the Chinese will take it and everybody will run with it, and you don't have the resources to compete. So I think, and I've tried over the years to contact some major corporations. All I'm saying is, like for a General Electric, if you want to capture good ideas from the crowd, you have to have a way for the ideas to be protected, and it's getting more difficult for the small inventor to even bother to invent something and put the energy in because the patent system is against them right now. You have to keep spending more tons of money.
Sure.
So.
Yeah, sure. So how did you guys address this question of sort of open and closed ownership of IP and how that affects these processes?
There's a lot of attention to this idea of open innovation. It's getting a lot of attention, and big companies are beginning to think about how to fully harness that idea. There's another idea that, hey, they have a lot of patents, they're maybe not being utilized, let's put them out into the public domain and see if people can utilize them in new ways. And so GE has actually done some of that. The other is actually for big firms to create venture capital teams, because there's huge domain expertise in big companies that can link up with these smaller companies. Also, if you find good ideas, big companies have a way to scale these technologies in ways that small companies don't. So you're finding actually a lot of attention to how to create corporate VCs right now. And I think that's a movement, and they're moving into this space in a much bigger way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to actually amplify what was just said. My question also was basically ownership of intellectual property. If you're going to have a community, ask the community to solve a problem, that implies a community ownership of the solution. That's not the way that business works, as far as I understand it. There are individuals or businesses that own these concepts or solutions. They profit from that. So isn't this ownership idea kind of counter, or isn't that something that has to be very seriously considered in the context of crowd sourcing of ideas and funding?
Well, I would say that there's a big bright line between crowdfunding and your IP position and portfolio. I mean, at least if you're a venture capitalist and your company doesn't have that barrier to entry through its IP, your risks of failure is a lot higher. That doesn't mean you can't use the crowd to help you, as I described earlier, either fund or refine your product. But I don't, certainly in the new company formation, if you look at the successful companies, there is something that they hold proprietary, and I don't see the two at odds, but I don't think that the crowd is going to be able to play a role as much in that part of a business.
If I may add to that, I think private ownership has been a huge success story. But if you look into the world, all the main ecological problems that we face are problems of commons. So it's really a crisis of commons. And what's missing is, after the success story of private ownership, that we need another round of innovation around common-based ownership. That's not like state ownership kind of up for grabs every 4 years or private ownership every quarter, but that really is organized in an intentional way to preserve the rights and the interests of the next generation.
And that commons might include intellectual property commons, but also other commons like land trusts and so on.
Well, on that point, I mean, there's a big movement in thinking about this idea of a share economy and how you can take assets that are being underutilized and more effectively utilized. And crowdsourcing can be applied to thinking through those problems. But I mean, Zipcar is just one example of an asset that isn't sufficiently utilized, that if you could set up the right mechanism, you can more widely utilize it. It's being used in companies actually where they have old factories that aren't being utilized because that production has moved elsewhere or whatever, and they're opening it up and allowing startups to use it. I mean, there's a bunch of different ways in which you can harness that concept, which means basically using assets more efficiently, which is good for the climate.
So we're also taking questions from Twitter. I was actually going to read one out, and then I found out that it's actually his tweet. So
Let's see the live
I'll let
version.
you ask your question. Okay, great. So this is, I'm going to combine a couple of questions that have come in through Twitter. This one's from Kim Brotu, and then also from Ken Caldera. So how open is safe? What issues and solutions have you seen regarding protecting the safety and privacy of organizations and citizens, but at the same time, opening up data to help foster growth? And then in conjunction with that, so don't great atrocities depend on the madness of crowds, Nazis, et cetera. So crowds are often unjust mobs. So how open is safe?
It sort of gets to this idea about, I think we've talked a little bit about how open is safe for the corporation, right? Like how much can you allow kind of intellectual property to be, in the commons? But I hear there's something else there about whether a sort of a personal privacy data concern in there, maybe like related to some of the mobile solutions that came out in the last panel, like. Does depending on the crowd require everybody to be more disclosive and open than?
But the crowdsourcing example that I described were GE employees, and so you're tapping into them. There's a whole system about how you share and who gets the rights to a patent if you're an employee. That's already a well-established system. Then there are these kinds of exercises you can do with crowdsourcing external to your organization, and GE has participated in these as have other companies, in which they put a cash prize out, they put data out there that allows external parties to analyze that. There's a lot of scrutiny that goes in, but you find that when you put that data out, you generate a whole new set of eyes on that problem that can lead to solutions. And so, you have to use discretion in terms of what data you put out there, but you'd be amazed. I think it's generally been a positive response in getting those new eyes and coming up with new efficiencies. So just an example there is the Quest that GE did last year, in which we used a platform, a company called Kaggle out on the West Coast ran that. and they put out a lot of flight data. And a team in Singapore came up with a solution that improved the performance by 40% over what the existing process were. So it's just another great example of how crowdsourcing can be used to drive innovative solutions that the existing processes weren't yielding.
Right, but there's certainly kind of an ethics of the crowd that arises, right? I mean, if we think of, so one of the ideas I was just thinking about was when you've got these bike sharing and car sharing systems, like the bike sharing systems, right? You can put out data about, the pattern of trips and then crowdsource ideas about how to better optimize the network.
Right.
But you just wouldn't want to put any identifiers of like who the actual users
Well,
were. Right?
Airbnb faced this dilemma where they're opening up, allowing people to open up and have strangers come into their house. How does that happen? Well, it turned out that they struggled at first, and then finally they put in an insurance policy. So the homeowner actually was made whole if a bad apple came. And those bad apples do come from time to time, but there's solutions for addressing them.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'll start with the context from Jason's when he said the success of an intervention depends on the inner state of the intervener. Now, in leveraging the crowd to solve some novel problems, like we have seen the examples talked about throughout, are there situations where we are faced with evaluating the solutions given by the crowd, because not everything can be quantified, like, we need an improvement of 40%. There's some situations or problems that may not actually may not have some way of evaluating in such a way. So I'm asking, what do you mean depends on the inner state of the intervener? Is that the quality of the intervention, or is I need some elaboration in that aspect from Jason Dassett.
Or from Otto.
Is that Otto?
So what I mean with the inner state of the intervener is really talking about the quality of attention. And I think it's really, in terms of, in this whole space where you deal with collective intelligence, one of the technical terms there is container building. And what people mean with container building is really the conditions that allow, in a safe way, a system to see itself, kind of, where you begin to see the situation not only through your own eyes, but also through the eyes of the other stakeholders in the system. And the leverage point usually is the most marginalized, which relates to the earlier question. So safe for whom? It's always kind of, is the solution at the expense of few groups or marginalized players that are excluded in the arrangement? And that's really where, when we think about the composition of these new innovation infrastructures that we need to bring in the entire ecosystem, which is kind of all key players that need each other, which is the ethical dimension, really. And it's not just kind of the powerfuls sitting together and making arrangements, the better organized special interest groups, making arrangements at the exclusion of groups that can't sit at the table. So for me, this inner place, really, it's like personal, it's kind of the quality of listening, really, but something that also needs to be put into place on a collective level. If you put it on a collective level, if you can cultivate that, it does have a very significant positive impact on the capacity of such a group to be co-creative.
And I think, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I would just add that the inputs from the crowd are part of in a business context, are important and add diversity and add people whose voices aren't heard, but it doesn't mean that they're all going to be useful. And so I think that the best companies, young companies, seek out the crowd, but there has to be leadership. There has to be, okay, well, we're experts here. We spend all of our lives at this point doing X, and yes, we've gotten this input from the crowd, but we're not going to listen. We're not going to use some of this, and that's kind of just, it doesn't, it's a little disappointing in terms of the kind of having everyone have a voice, but
everyone does have a voice, but in a business, some voices you listen to and some you don't. And you have to kind of lead in terms of knowing that it's the right thing to seek more input and use crowds, but also you need to lead in terms of taking a stake and putting a plan together that digests and works the information you've gotten from the crowd.
I think there's something in this also, which is that we've been predominantly talking about, I think a lot of the way we've been talking about crowdsourcing ideas frames climate change as a set of technical issues, as a set of technical solutions, and that we're trying to crowdsource, we're talking about crowdsourcing or crowdfunding the best ideas for solving these technical problems. But climate change is inherently not just a technical problem, it's also a political problem, right? It's also a question of how are we going to allocate the costs and risks and benefits of climate change problems and solutions. And so inherently in any crowd-based approach that's going to solve this problem, it can't just be evaluated on purely technical grounds. It has to be evaluated on political grounds. And that means that we do need to have some way of enhancing the moral imagination of people who are participating in the crowd system, right? And I kind of got that from what you were saying, is that you're talking about a container building. I mean, the way that you design a crowd-based approach to solving climate change has to include this political dimension of understanding and having some empathy for how the solutions that you're coming up with are actually going to affect someone else in this ecosystem of idea provision and who are going to ultimately bear the cost. And I think that notion of climate as a political question, which demands political mobilization at times, which can use the crowd in interesting ways, is going to be something that we really touch on in the panels in the afternoon. And I want to thank you guys for kind of bringing out some very diverse perspectives and ideas here and kind of bringing them together into a conversation. And thank you for the audience questions as well. We're out of time, so I'm unfortunately going to have to take the last questions offline. Thank you.
Thank you.